Welcome back to the class. We are continuing the same discussion on Ulrich Beck's arguments about the risk society. This is the continuation of the previous class, and the next class as well will be the continuation in which we will discuss the same topic, his very important and forceful arguments about the contemporary society as a risk society. So just to have a very brief recap, he argues that we need to identify the contemporary society as a risk society because the risk has become so prevalent, and risk is the unintended consequence of a modern life. So he puts forward 5 theses about the risk. The first one is a kind of very interesting relationship between risk, identification of risk, and a knowledge system, especially that of science. But he also discusses about the inability of science to address or to engage with the kind of magnitude of questions that are raised by the risk society. And second thesis that he put forward is a kind of a argument that the risk society burst asunder the class schema. The risk is something so pervasive for everybody that whether it's rich or poor, they are supposed to face this risk scenario. But this distinction, the class distinction, will have a direct impact on the consequences of risk. And the third one that he is talking about is the marketability of risk. This is again a very fascinating topic. So, what are the consequences of such a perception of risk? What are the consequences of such a perception of risk? And is a risk something that everybody is critical of, that everybody despises, everybody curse that? Or are there people, or are there institutions, or are there mechanisms, institutionalized ways in which we make use of this perception of risk? Risks are becoming more and more amenable to definition by science, and the one condition the other, risks are a growing business. Okay, so risk is not something that everybody equally condemns or everybody equally hates. There are people who always find a business opportunity in these emerging fields of risk, or there are people who are doing thriving business by making use of this pervasive sense of fear or anxiety about risk. Risks are the driving force of economic boom because they are the interminable needs sought by economists. Quite a new needs, and hence new markets can be created by changing the definition of risk. Needs that are open to interpretation can be causally constituted and proliferated endlessly. Thus, production and consumption are raised to a new stage as the risk society becomes entrenched. You look at our own society, our own surroundings, and then see that how many companies, how many business establishments are now thriving on this sense of risk. Starting with our water purifiers. We simply did not have any mechanism for purifying water some 50 or 100 years back, and nobody really cared about it. Of course, it had its own consequences. But now we know that and even ordinary water that we get from our tap in any of the urban centers in India is unsafe to drink. So we are forced to depend upon water purifiers. And then water purifiers, they speak the language of science, and they speak the language of how many kind of adulterations or impurities or very dangerous pathogens can be found in your water, and then you need to process it through reverse osmosis or a host of other technologically loaded terms are provided. So an ordinary household in India, in any Indian city, is forced to depend upon either on purified water or purification systems. And even purified water that we are getting, okay, in bottled waters, what you call it as mineral water or pure water, we know that there have been several reports that they are not adequately purified, and they contain quite a lot of impurities and other stuff. So similarly, air purifiers have become a major business avenue now. And similarly, everywhere there are insurance companies that take care of your credit cards. If there is some fraud happens to your bank account, if somebody cheats you online, there are insurance companies. So there are insurance companies to take care of your credit cards and your bank accounts, or every such perceivable or, issues or scenarios of risk are being turned it into possibilities of business. So this production and consumption are raised to a new stage as the risk society becomes entrenched. Risks must, so to speak, grow as they are brought under control. Okay, so many people, for quite a lot of them, risk is not something that has to be simply resolved and then completely resolved and then finished off. The moment they do that, their business will be affected. So business is something that they must be allowed to grow. Okay, they must be regulated, they must be allowed to grow. They must not actually be eliminated by getting the origin and causes. Okay, even we know that when you take the case of say water purifier or air purifier, none of these companies are talking about stemming the root cause of that. Okay, how do we stop polluting our soil? How do we stop polluting our rivers? How do we stop polluting the air? These questions are simply not addressed by these companies. They would say that it's not in our purview, we can't do that. But at the same time, they are not also interested in doing that. Okay, that in most of the European societies, the tap water is you can drink. It's potable water. You can straight away take water from there, ordinary tap and then street tap and then drink it. Okay, so it means that they are able to preserve their water bodies, their lakes and their rivers and their groundwater free from any contaminations. Okay, but here in India or in vast part of the third world countries, it's not possible because we have been systematically polluting them. Okay, by opening our drainage and then effluents directly into these water bodies. So none of these companies or these entrepreneurs are interested in completely eliminating the source of such kind of pollution, because then it also means a closure of their own business opportunities. Everything must take place within the framework of risk cosmetics. Okay, it only works as a kind of a cosmetic action. Packaging, symptomatic reduction in pollutants and installation of purifying filters while the source of the filth is retained. Thus, there is not a preventive but only a symbolic politics and industry to eliminate proliferating risk. So this is an extremely important point, because we know that any number of scientific discoveries or scientific technologies or scientific innovations will resolve the issue of pollution. Because until you come across a scenario where you address the whole question of profitability, you address the question of how firms are allowed to work, certain policy decisions, certain ethical decisions, unless you address those larger issues, the whole issue about providing water filter is not going to work. The fourth thesis is consciousness determines being, knowledge of risk, the state of being affected by risk. So he talks about how this a consciousness of the pervasiveness of the risk, and then the whole idea of being affected with that, and how that is connected with the idea of consciousness. The boundaries of specialized areas and disciplines, specialized competence and institutional authorities, the distinction between value and fact, and hence between ethics and human sciences and the natural science. And finally, they cut across seemingly institutionally segregated domains of politics, the public, science and economics. The modern world found itself constrained to de-differentiate in bringing the risks of civilization under control. Okay, so this whole question of being affected by the possibility of risk, and the whole question of being affected by risk and its implications, and what to do with that, and how an ordinary person is forced to live under such a situation, they're all affected by much larger consciousness of being affected by the risk. So these boundaries of specialized arenas and disciplines, specialized competence and institutional authorities, distinction between value and fact, all these things appear to be highly jumbled when you look into that. So we just had the previous example of a set of scientists might be able to identify the root cause of a particular disease, but their expertise simply ends there. They are unable to answer larger questions about the question of, say for example, its compensation, or how to fix the responsibility of this whole disaster. simply they simply do not have the right or the knowledge or the expertise or the exposure to address such kind of questions. So a whole set of taken for granted distinctions between say specialized areas and disciplines, specialized competence and institutional authorities, distinction between value and fact, and then hence between ethics, the human science and the natural science, because the whole question of ethics comes as a very important question. Whether you are able to scientifically argue that okay, this disease is caused by that or not, but then what do you do that? How do you bring in the question of ethics? So all these things are much beyond the purview of the natural sciences. And finally, they cut across the seemingly institutionally segregated domains of politics, the public, the science, and then economics, because it's a set of vexed questions that these issues of risk actually bring forward. And the usual distinction between objective risks that are discovered and determined by science and the relatively irrational perception of risk by the public is based on a categorical error. Okay, so you see that many times we try to come to a conclusion that okay, whether the people feel so that the people are having high number of morbidities or high number of diseases, and this is because of a kind of a blind belief, because of their ignorance. Let a group of scientists come and then do an experiment and then do a study and then find it out or not. And this whole distinction between superstition of people or public opinion of people on the one side and expert opinion of the people of the scientists on the other side, this distinction itself is turning out to be artificial. This distinction itself turning out to be quite problematic, especially in a host of, I gave you the example of this endosulfan, or there are n number of similar examples where even the scientific community does not reach a kind of a consensus. There are very different opinion about kind of people. Again, take the case of a host of genetically modified crops. What would be its possible implications? The scientific community is not on the same platform. So you come across such kind of very different kind of scenario, and the whole idea of science as capable of telling you the truth or the objectivity simply vanishes. Everywhere, scientific risk research lags behind the social and environmental progress and cultural critique of the industrial system. What does it mean? Everywhere, scientific risk research lags behind the social and environmental progress and cultural critique of the industrial system, because it is a cultural and environmental critique that brings forward the whole idea of the possibilities of risk or negative consequences. Only once they are raised that the scientific community comes and then tries to make sense of that. It's not the other way around. The scenarios of the other way around, it is very, very limited. The question that must be asked on the example of risk perception is how rationality emerges socially. That is, how it is believed, how does it become questionable, how it is defined, how is it refined, how is it acquired, and how is it squandered. It's a very, very important point. The whole question of rationality. Okay, I hope you have some familiarity with Max Weber's argument about rationality. So Weber argued that one of the very fundamental features of the modern era or the period of modernity is the emergence of rationality, scientific rationality. Okay, so scientific rationality was able to displace the religious authority and the traditional authority, because science is able to discard or dismiss a whole set of knowledge systems that was based on tradition and religion. And scientific rationality gave you the assurance, or they gave you the confidence that with the use of your rationality, your intellect, you will be able to make sense of, you will be able to understand the world around you, and then you will be able to lead a life far better, compared to that of your previous generation. So this was the kind of optimism that scientific rationality provided, and that's why we believed that science is the ultimate answer to every human problem. But now we realize that in the late modern era, scientific rationality or the scientific knowledge is only one of the possible knowledge systems or interpretations that are available to people. Okay, you can take different position. Okay, that's a different thing. You can agree with other thing, you can disagree with that, but you increasingly realize that the scientific argument constitutes only one particular type of rationality. There are other multiple types of rationalities available, and maybe the best example could be that of in the field of medicine. We know that modern medicine has made huge advancements. It has made huge, progress in terms of eliminating death rate and eliminating diseases. Definitely, the world health system or health system of India in particular is far, far better than that of maybe some 100 years or 50 years ago. But if you look into the health system now, the modern medicine is only one among the health systems available. Okay, there is increasing skepticism towards modern medicine. There are increasing criticisms against modern medicine now, and that could be based on maybe increasing cost, or maybe issues about the side effects, or issues about a host of other issues. But you will not be able to convince anybody simply on the basis of this modern medicine or its rationality. There are equally powerful other rationalities exist, and whether you personally agree or not, this is a kind of a reality. So how different rationalities are believed, how does it become questionable, and how is it identified, how is it defined, how is it acquired, and how is it squandered? The issue with scientific claims and their claims over truth and objectivity. And this, comes from a much larger critique of scientific claim to objectivity and truth. Basically from philosophy of science and the kind of a post-scientific scenario. So I'm not going into that, but we know that the science itself does not have a monopolistic claim over the truth. Okay, the very, very character of science itself is like that. Today's scientific finding might turn out to be a false finding tomorrow, and something else might come in. Or today's evidences will be demonstrated as false evidences. So tomorrow we will be forced to believe something else. So all these things will have very significant consequences on the larger issues. Now, another example, that very interesting example that he gives, is this issue of permissible limit of chemicals, poisons, etc. This is again a very interesting aspect of science, because if you look at the scientific scientific standard about what is a permissible limit of chemicals or pesticides or poison that is allowed in your food, there are different standards available in India. There are different institutions available in India which allow that a particular ppm, parts per million count of a particular pesticide is allowed, a threshold value. So they always keep a kind of a threshold value. So it gives you an idea that little bit of poison is okay, but that poison should not exceed a particular limit. Okay, so you see that whether it's the case of antibiotics in chicken, or antibiotics in other animal products, or chemicals or coloring agents, or any similar kind of chemicals in food articles. So they all talk about a kind of a permissible limit. And this itself is a very ethically problematic issue and scientifically problematic issue. How do we come to that kind of a conclusion? Is that permissible limit is categorical? Is it not going to change? Okay, what is the kind of a scientific basis to say that okay, this much of permissible limit is allowed? Because science itself is the one which is speaking in this language. So they all raise a lot of issues associated with that. One comes up against the hard law sooner than later that if risks are not scientifically recognized, they do not exist. At least not legally, medically, or technologically and socially. That is, they are not hindered, treated, or compensated. Very important point. We know that if they are not scientifically recognized, so even the claims of the victims will have to be articulated in such a manner. Okay, it has to be amenable to the reception of scientific community. It has to be approved by a science by a scientist, or it has to be approved by a scientific board. So if the scientific establishment of science turns a blind eye, the kind of sufferings and the problems that these people face, it will continue to be the same story. The monopoly that scientific judgment has on truth This forces those affected to make use of all the means and methods of scientific analysis to bring their claims to bear. The crisis in scientific authority can thus actually serve to put up a general smoke screen around risk. The critique of science can also be counterproductive as far as recognizing risk is concerned. Okay, so there is no other way that we can articulate the issues associated with risk other than through the language of science. So you must have come across a whole lot of people who are anti-scientist. Scienticism has become a major fashion now, or it has become a major trend now. There are quite a lot of people who are extremely bitter about the modernity. They are quite bitter about the advancement of modernity and science, and they all have a very glorious, very romantic idea about the pre-scientific or pre-modern world, where they think that people lived a far better life. People ate everything healthy. People ate all natural, unadulterated food. These are all very romantic exaggerations about our past. If you simply ask the question, what was the kind of life expectancy some 100 years back, or what was the life expectancy when India got independence? Okay, what was the death rate? What was the morbidity rate? What was the child morbidity rate or infant mortality rate? If you simply ask these questions, then the whole hypocrisy of this whole over romanticization becomes very clear. But the point here is that even to articulate the risk of science, even while you criticize science, you have no other way but to make use of the scientific language and discourses. The fifth thesis that Beck talks about is that a society of risk creates the political potential for a dirigist policy. So what is a dirigist policy? A dirigist policy is a scenario where the state assumes or state undertakes very arbitrary decisions. There is an overreach of the state. Okay, so that kind of a policy, and this is extremely important now. And this is a very interesting point where Beck makes a connection between the risk and the whole question of our governance, the role of state, our rights, citizenship rights, and political processes, and host of other things. And this becomes very interesting, especially in the background of the recent COVID pandemic. We know that how there was a lot of criticism against the way in which the state governments, whether in India or abroad, really responded. There were a lot of criticisms against state governments acting in a very partisan manner, in a very undemocratic manner. And Beck makes a lot of very interesting arguments to make sense of that. So the more dramatically the dangers in the modernization process accumulate, the more patently the central values of the community are threatened, and the more clearly this enters the consciousness of all. So this risk or an impending crisis or impending catastrophe is seen as the ruse. It is seen as an excuse for a highly draconian actions, highly high-handed actions, to completely dismiss due processes, dismiss decentralized decision making. So every decision will have to be made very fast, and they will present this as an excuse for a highly centralized form of action. And that, he says, is a very important inherent feature of this risk society. Then all the more deeply will be the power and authority structures in the relationship among economics, politics, and the public and the private domain be undermined. And the more probable it will be that a redefinition of responsibilities will bear the stamp of the impending danger. The powers to act will be centralized, and all the details of the modernization process will be covered over by the bureaucratic control and planning. And I can't imagine than again and again giving the example of this COVID-19 pandemic. We know that how our basic freedom are curtailed, restrictions were imposed, a host of decisions were taken without much of a consultation because nobody had any cue. Okay, scientific community was completely at dark, policymakers were completely at dark, and nobody had any idea about how to deal with this pandemic. Okay, so that is a scenario when a more centralized form of power establishment works, and more authoritative kind of power decisions, power politics take place. So in other words, The other side of danger is the legitimation and normalization of emergency action, making things seem self-evident that otherwise would be inconceivable and unrealizable. At the same time, it becomes clear that totally new challenges to democracy arise in a society of risk as the dangers accumulate. Okay, so any scenario, any possibility of a risk is also a possibility of dangers to the very practice of democracy. Because in a risky scenario, in a scenario where you are faced with risk, generally it is very easy to convince everybody that we simply do not have the time to listen to everybody. So this is the decision, you better obey that. Okay, and it looks very convincing, and that's what in every decisions at the time of lockdown or at the time of dealing with the COVID-19 across the world and also in India were accepted with very least amount of resistance or least amount of criticism. So at the end, what does it do to democracy? Okay, what does it do to establish practices of democracy is a big question, because it's never going to facilitate democratic process, rather it's going to endanger the prospects of democracy. The extent that risk is experienced as omnipresent, there are only three possible reactions: denial, apathy and transformation. The first is largely inscribed in the modern culture, the denial. The second resemble postmodern nihilism, that is apathy, that we don't care, nothing can be done kind of argument. The third is the cosmopolitan moment of world risk society, that is a transformation. So Beck is talking about all these changes, all these possibilities of risk, basically to visualize a cosmopolitan society, a cosmopolitan movement, and that becomes even more apparent in his second article as well. So he, as in the case of a cosmopolitan state that he visualized might take place in the whole world, he's also arguing that this world risk society, this ever omnipresent threat of risk will actually push us towards a kind of a cosmopolitan moment. The key distinction between risk and catastrophe: risk does not mean catastrophe. Okay, risk means the anticipation of catastrophe. Very important point. Risk is the anticipation of catastrophe. Okay, a nuclear radioactivity, once we know that every nuclear reactor is a potential danger, so that is a kind of a risk. We know that the fuel that is stored in a nuclear reactor, it will have to be disposed of somewhere. Okay, but where do you dispose of, or what happens to some these reactors because of some human error or some natural calamity? We know that that's an impending danger. So that it's an anticipation of a catastrophe. Risk exists in a permanent state of virtuality. Okay, it's never materialized, but it's about to become materialized and become topical only to the extent that they are anticipated. Risks are not real; they are becoming real. So it's every moment it's possibility of becoming real. At the moment at which risk becomes real, for example, in the shape of a terrorist attack, they cease to be risk and becomes catastrophe. Okay, a nuclear explosion, a nuclear leak, or a terrorist attack, it becomes a catastrophe, and then catastrophe brings in completely different kind of dynamics and other forms of mechanisms, but risk has already moved elsewhere. Risks are always events that are threatening. Without techniques of visualization, without symbolic forms, without mass media, etc., risks are nothing at all. In other words, it is irrelevant whether we live in a world which is in fact or in some sense objectively safer than all other worlds. If destruction and disasters are anticipated, then that produces a compulsion to act. So this is again from the second essay, where he gives the larger argument that there are these techniques about visualization, symbolic forms, mass media, these play a very important role in the understanding of risk. So the theory of world risk society maintains that modern societies are shaped by a new kinds of risk, that their foundations are shaken by the global anticipation of global catastrophe. Such perception of global risk are characterized by three features. Okay, so three important features of the risk. One is delocalization. Its causes and consequences are not limited to one geographical location or space. They are in principle omnipresent. I don't think I need to explain it much further. The issue of Fukushima reactor or issue of Chernobyl disaster. These radioactive clouds, they simply do not know the continental boundaries or national boundaries. It becomes completely beyond the geographical location and then spread across. The delocalization of incalculable interdependency risk takes place at three levels. So, one is this kind of a spatial. The new risk, that is climate change, do not respect nation states or any other borders. Second, temporal. The new risks have a long latency period, okay, nuclear waste, so that their effect over time cannot be really reliably determined and limited. Any forms of pollution for that matter, or even we do not know what is happening as a result of the global warming or the rising temperature or the depletion of ozone layers. So, the kind of a temporal implication of that also is unknown. Then the social. Thanks to the complexity of the problems and the length of chains of effect, assignment of causes and consequences is no longer possible with any degree of reliability, whether it is financial crisis, the global financial crisis, or a kind of a particular economic crisis. What happens? How do you fix the responsibility? What could be the consequences of that on different section of people? All these things become absolutely incalculable. Second one is incalculableness. Okay, the first one we mentioned is the delocalization from a particular location. It emerges as something beyond time and beyond place. Second one is incalculableness. Its consequences are in principle incalculable. At bottom is a matter of hypothetical risk, which are not least are based on science-induced not knowing and normative dissent. Okay, so many times you simply do not know how to calculate the risk as well as the consequences of that, and are based on science-induced. Yeah, so many times the response towards science response towards the risk is induced by science-induced not knowing and normative dissent. About how do you make your dissent specifically clear to that. The crucial point, however, is not only the discovery of the unknown unknowns, but that simultaneously the knowledge, control and security claim of the state and society were indeed had to be renewed, deepened and expanded. The irony lies in the institutionalized security claim and to have control something even if one does not know whether it exists or not. So here he talks about the utter inability of nation states or the establishment to these kind of risks that are waiting in the dark. We know that none of the nation states were really prepared for a pandemic like COVID-19. Okay, or no nation states were prepared for a economic crisis as happened in 2008. Or no nation state is really prepared for a biological warfare or a chemical warfare or a nuclear warfare. But all these establishments claim that we are all prepared, we all have enough precautions. And the best example that quite a lot of people put forward is the 9/11 attack on the Twin Towers. Okay, so that was a time when America had spent billions and billions of rupees on their defense, on their military, on their all spyware, on their all high tech military hardwares, and that's a time when some of the most ingenious, most intelligent, most creative ways of attacking American soil was conceived by these terrorists who used the passenger plane and the fuel as the weapon of mass destruction. So many times you are caught off guard. Many times all your preparations go simply in vain and the risk becomes incalculable. But why should a science or discipline concerns itself with what does not even know? So he asks a very important question. If that is the character of risk, then why should a discipline like sociology be concerned about it? Because anyway things are unknown to us. We don't know anything what is going to happen. So why to bother? There is a certainly conclusive sociological answer to that. Because in the face of the production of insuperable manufactured uncertainties, society is more than ever relies and insists on security and control. And because of the argument about knowing and not knowing of global risk, cancel the established national and international rule systems. Okay, so such a system, such a fear of impending risk from unknown sources, they have the ability to completely destroy and disturb our established patterns of power relations. As we mentioned earlier, power relations can become absolutely authoritative. It can turn out to be absolutely undemocratic, and in the light of this unknown unknowns, power relations and democratic systems can simply go for a toss. Okay, so let us stop here and take a break, and we'll come back for the next class. Thank you.